Uma universidade conectada com o seu tempo, com a ciência e com a formação humana. A Universidade de Caxias do Sul é uma universidade comunitária que tem como missão produzir, sistematizar e socializar o conhecimento com qualidade e relevância para o desenvolvimento sustentável. Conectada com você, sua vida e seus sonhos. Cerca de 100.000 pessoas levam no seu currículo o nome da Universidade de Caxias do Sul. Mas o legado de uma universidade não pode ser só medido pelo número de pessoas que ela formou, mas também pelos conceitos e ideias que ela ajudou a revolucionar, pelas empresas que ajudou a implantar e até mesmo pelos sonhos que ela ajudou a concretizar. A marca da UX ultrapassou as barreiras do tempo e os limites do espaço. Ela está impressa em milhares de histórias e conquistas e segue sua trajetória de sucesso, preparando pessoas com capacidade para transformar o mundo, criar o novo e antecipar o futuro. Universidade de Caxias do Sul.
Já tivemos, Juliana.
Boa tarde a todos. Gostaria de saudar todas as pessoas que nos assistem pela transmissão de YouTube, saudar os professores do PPGA, os alunos, os nossos convidados, dizer que é uma grande alegria a gente iniciar essa aula inaugural com uma palestra extremamente relevante, com um convidado muito, muito importante, Professor Tony Lloyd. Welcome, Professor Lloyd. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation to this masterclass. Eu gostaria de agradecer a todos o interesse. O PPGA tem feito um esforço bastante importante para desenvolver suas conexões internacionais e para trabalhar cada vez mais temas que são importantes e que tenham um impacto para o desenvolvimento da nossa região e para o desenvolvimento do nosso país, como no caso de hoje, a temática em relação às cidades, ao desenvolvimento, às questões urbanas. Então, muito obrigado a todos que nos acompanham nessa palestra, e eu, de imediato, passo a palavra para o professor Fabiano, e em seguida, as nossas alunas, a Suelen, do doutorado, e a Cristiane, do mestrado, vão fazer a mediação dessa aula inaugural. Então, professor Fabiano, muito obrigada pela sua presença, e a palavra está com você.
Bom, boa tarde a todos e a todas. Em nome do nosso pró-reitor de pesquisa e pós-graduação, professor Juliano Rodrigues de Menes, saúdo a todos os que estão presentes aqui, os professores que vão estar ministrando a palestra, especialmente o professor Tony, e reforçando em nome da pró-reitoria e enaltecendo a iniciativa desenvolvida pelo programa. Coloco em nome da professora Ana Cristina Facchignelli, coordenadora do curso, mas eu sei que também tem muito envolvimento aí dos bolsistas, né, são muito atuantes nessa parte aí, então, mais uma vez, parabenizando o programa como um todo, tanto professores quanto alunos, esse trabalho que vem sendo desenvolvido, principalmente na tônica relativa às cidades e ao desenvolvimento regional, um ponto que vem sendo desenvolvido no programa com bastante qualificação. Então, desejo a todos e a todas presentes aqui uma boa palestra com muitos aprendizados relativos ao assunto que vai ser tratado.
Ok, então boa tarde a todos. Em primeiro lugar, eu gostaria de deixar um recado, que todos que tiverem perguntas ao nosso palestrante, então elas podem ser escritas no chat, tanto em português quanto em inglês, e elas serão feitas, então, ao Tony no final da nossa palestra. So, I'd like to introduce you to Professor Tony Lloyd-Jones. He's a reader in International Planning and Sustainable Development in the School of Architecture and Cities at the University of Westminster in London. He's Director of Research and Consultancy at the university's Max Lock Center, International Sustainable Development Research Unit, as well as working as a consultant under the wider umbrella of Max Lock International Associates. Tony has conducted international development-related research for over 30 years, as well as urban sustainability-related projects in the UK and Europe. As Urban Policy and Statistics Advisor to DFID from 1997 to 2005, he advised the UK government on shelter and sustainable urban development issues at the United Nations. His policy-focused research focuses on spatial planning, management, and development impacts of rapid urbanization in developing world cities and regions, addressing institutional, economic, social, environmental, and climate change concerns in different areas of sub-Saharan Africa, South and Southeast Asia, and Latin America. This is underpinned by the long-standing experience and expertise of the Max Lock team in GIS-based urban spatial analysis, statistical modeling, and mapping. Tony is an author of recent policy guidance on urban resilience, disaster risk management, and reconstruction for the UK government, the World Bank, and other agencies. So, Tony, we welcome you, and now we would like to hear you.
Thank you very much indeed, Suelen. I'm very happy to be invited to present to you. I'm very grateful for Raquel for thinking of it and inviting me. So, just to introduce my colleague Federico as well. who works closely with me. We work closely together. I've been working on this kind of work for some years now, and Fede is from Uruguay, so I think he would understand your questions in Portuguese. Once upon a time, I used to play in a samba band, and most of the players were Chileans, so the mixture of Spanish and Portuguese was something that I was very used to. Okay, so let me see if I can. I think that the summary that you've just had gives a potted idea of what we're about to show you. Fede's been helping me with the presentation today. Let me see if I can pull it up. I'm not very used to Google Meet, but I think it's okay. All right, so full screen. Okay, so as you know, the title, it's a bit of a long title, a bit like my title, Planning and Sustainable Development, informing urban policy to address the challenges of rapid urbanization in scarce local data context. So I think, so I will be talking about issues around rapid urbanization, where we work, but in particular about this issue of how do we quickly and efficiently and effectively collect local data where there is, it's very patchy or thin on the ground or old or unreliable. And I think at the end we might come back to some research we've just started on the international impact of COVID, where again the data can vary, very much across the different countries and at the local level. So just briefly, who we are. I teach a course, MA International Planning and Sustainable Development, that one of your colleagues, Raquel, is studying on. Before the course came into being, we set up something called the Max Lock Center. Max Lock was a architect planner, as we are, both Fede and I, and was quite well known in UK and internationally for the planning work that he did with his colleagues, drawing on the ideas of somebody called Patrick Geddes, who actually was a Scottish biologist, but had a very strong influence on town planning in Britain, with his idea of civic diagnosis, trying to understand the way that people in cities worked, in relation also to their environment as well, to their natural environment, and the idea of community participation, and the idea really of sustainable development before it really became formulated. So, sorry, let me go back. So Max, I don't seem to be able to control it now. Okay, there we are. So Max Lock died some years ago, quite a long time ago, but he recruited some of my colleagues when I was graduating from architecture school. They went off to work in Nigeria, and a lot of our work subsequently is based on the work that was done at that time in Nigeria. And my colleagues from Nigeria came back and they brought with them the town planning group and all the materials from Max Lock's previous work, and an archive was set up at the university, which was the basis of the research unit that followed. And it also includes the work of somebody called John Turner, who is also very well known in the self-help housing field. So apart from the center in the university, the international associates, the consultancy has been mentioned, set up as a partnership fairly recently. We revived the organization in Nigeria some years ago, Maxlock Consultancy Nigeria, separate company, and we also have a small unit in India, in New Delhi. And as mentioned, we've done work across the world, as you can see, primarily in Africa, and I'll explain why that's been important. Quite a lot of work in Brazil, not recently, but going back a few years. We have been continuing to work in India. We're trying to maintain the base in Asia, and occasionally we've done work on sustainable development issues in the UK and across Europe. So this sort of curve you probably are familiar with. It's a breakdown of urban and rural population according to, in this case, the World Bank income groups. And we can see that going back 70 years ago or so, that by far the majority of the population of the world was living in rural areas. Fairly recently, that balance changed in favor of urban and is continuing to increase, and the majority of the new urban population, so 2018, 55% of the total, of about 7 billion. And it's expected that by 2050, most of the additional urban population is in what's called the middle income, lower middle income, upper middle income countries, which includes Brazil. Whereas the urban population in the developed, most richest part of the world is pretty static, and the rural population is gradually declining. But the important thing here, I think, is that the growth rate is actually slowing down. Population growth is slowing down across the world due to declining fertility rates primarily. But Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, is lagging, which means that its population is continuing to grow fairly rapidly, and its urban population in particular is growing very rapidly. So as things stand, Asia has got the biggest proportion of urban population, as you'd expect. But Africa's growing. It's heavily concentrated in certain regions of the world, as we can see in India and China, Europe, USA, and Latin America, coastal Brazil in particular. But one thing that's striking is economic inequality. And although if you look at the GDP figures as a whole, you might find many countries in Africa are growing quite fast, not all. Per capita, the gap between the rich world and the lower income world is growing all the time, is continuing to grow. So GDP per capita is still, the gap is still growing at the country level, let alone at the individual level, of course. And what that means for Africa is that it's gone through a process of rapid urbanization. This is an index starting from 1950, and you can see that the urban proportion of urban population is increased by a factor of 5, whereas the GDP per capita has increased, but it went down in the 1980s because of structural adjustment policies. Debt and so on has increased again recently, but many countries have actually had another slump. So again, this is sometimes called urbanization without economic growth. Not strictly speaking, but it is a case that the urbanization is outpacing the economic development, economic growth. And the consequence of that is, in particular, the growth of the urban informal economy. This is a big element of the economy right across Africa, as in many parts of Asia, and of course in parts of Latin America as well. But what we particularly interested in as planners, which is the main focus of our work, is housing, how people are going to be housed, how we're going to house another 2.3 billion urban dwellers by 2050. And this was really a sort of a guesswork breakdown of how people are mostly housed in the world as things that stand at the moment, divided into low income, middle income and high income countries. And as you may know, most of the housing in the lowest income countries and in many parts of the middle income countries is informal. That is through land subdivisions, families and households basically developing and building their own dwellings. And that's more or less disappears by the time you get to the high income level, not entirely. Then there is the case of commercial developer-led development, where developers buy up land and develop it, which is still relatively small in in the low-income countries, beginning to be quite significant in middle-income countries, and is pretty common in high-income countries. Multi-family occupancy, blocks of apartment buildings and so on, again, obviously more frequent in the high-income countries. And social housing in multiple occupancy, again, growing in middle-income countries and shrinking again in high-income countries as these kind of properties are sold off to the private sector. So the consequence of that for the sort of work that we do is the very wide prevalence of informal land subdivision and incremental self-built housing, which is helping to fill the housing gap. This is very much driven by housing finance as well, because if you have a job in the informal sector, you may not have a regular income, you certainly won't be able to get a mortgage, and therefore you have to rely on other sources of finance and build your dwelling on an incremental basis. And you're helped on your way by land developers who get their land from the farmers and sell it off to people who begin to occupy the land, normally without any legal right to be doing so. And gradually over time, this is how the how the urban development takes place in many parts of the world. The important thing for us is that it's a pattern of growth, and what we rely on is understanding how development takes place and what sort of patterns of growth emerge for us to be able to articulate urban areas as a basis for trying to work out their socioeconomic and demographic characteristics, and that's what we're coming to shortly. So this is, as I'm sure most people have seen, Google Earth images and so on, satellite images. It's fairly clear where the informal slum developments are. This is Caracas, and where the where the formal developments are, just in terms of the visual inspection of the satellite imagery and the evident layouts and the forms that you can visualize from looking at satellite imagery, which we tend to do a lot of, particularly FEDI these days. So an early example, just to add a little bit of context, the original Maxlock group, before my colleagues got involved, they went to Nigeria in 1965 at the invitation of the British government to work with the newly independent Nigerian government. And they went to a city called Kaduna, which was actually a colonial established city in the north of Nigeria, and were asked to do a master plan for the city. This is 1965, 1967. I have an elderly colleague, even older than I am, who's in his 90s, who was largely involved with that plan, still working with us. And in the 90s, he went back to Nigeria, and that's when he met with the colleagues that we worked with there and recreated the Maxlock group. And then we were invited to go back and revisit the 1967 master plan and come up with a new one. And in the meantime, satellite imagery and GIS had become quite prevalent, and the new methodologies were introduced, and drawing on actually methods that were used previously by the Maxlock group in Nigeria. We developed this idea of using satellite imagery to articulate the different areas of the city, different character areas of the city, as a basis for trying to understand how the city worked, and particularly as a basis for carrying out surveys. So this methodology very much depends on carrying out field work and surveys on the ground, and using the data from the different morphological units, as we call them, as a basis for designing surveys and understanding the data that we get from surveys. So at that time and subsequently, we've always regarded being asked to do plans as a means of collecting data in a form that the local government, or in the case of Nigeria, it's a state government, can use for subsequent urban management. And so the data, in a way, is as important as the plan, because, as you may know, plans very often don't get implemented, more often than not. But the data is a framework with which the government can manage its urban services and development plans more effectively. So this map in the middle shows an early typology map that we drew of Kaduna, which dates from 2010, when the city was about 10 times the size that it was in 1965. And we classified 5 different land development or settlement types, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a minute, from middle class and elite areas to unplanned, what you might call slum areas, enforcements, and urban villages. And in Kaduna, we conducted 2 main types of survey. We do what's called a land use survey, where every property is recorded, and the use of that property and its characteristics are recorded on a database. So we have a land use plan of the city, and we're able to tell where all the residential dwellings are, and a household interview, a sample household interview survey, In the case of Kaduna, we did 11,000 households, which is quite a substantial survey, but you need to do surveys on that scale if you want to drill down to get the sort of reliable local data that is useful for urban management purposes. And on the right, there's a little graph that shows some of the data from the household interview survey on sanitation being clearly a key planning concern for the city, and how it related to different settlement types, from the poorest to the richest. So I won't have time to go through this. The main part of this presentation is about the morphological approach. That's needs to have the land use and the field surveys and the household surveys, and the survey designs are very much influenced by the morphological or the spatial analysis that we undertake. But I don't really have time to go into that today, except to say that we do fairly detailed survey designs to ensure fairly good statistical reliability of the data. But it also in trying to do this kind of analysis, we need to get an understanding of the population of each of the units that we're defining, which is termed here in demo morphological analysis. That's partly based on the mapping, but obviously we have also to work out what the population is of each area, particularly as we're using it for survey purposes. And the starting point for that is any data that we can already find. So there is usually a census. It's very often out of date, and it's very difficult to find very fine grain local area census data. So we work with what we've got. We use a modeling approach. We try and bring it up to date through modeling. And we work on an iterative process of looking at areas that are fairly homogeneous and have a census population figure. And we use that as a starting point for working out a model for the city, taking into account the fact that the density of the types varies across the profile of the city. As you get towards the periphery, and the density is much lower. And the population change across the city also varies. I'm going to have to stop for a minute. Fedi, are you able to speak to this? I'll change the slides as you speak to it, okay?
Okay, Tony, yes.
All right, so I've just got to do something. So if you want to just give a description of this exercise that we did in East Africa, yeah?
Yeah, can you go to the next one?
Yeah.
Okay, as Tony said, my name is Federico Redin. I'm an architect and planner. I've been working with Tony for 6 years now. My work basically is in Africa, and all the process that Tony is describing, one of the main reasons is because there is no data, or really little data in African cities. For example, the slide now is showing a city which is called Hargeisa. It's in Somaliland. Somaliland is part of Somalia, or an independent part of Somalia. So we start working on this project in 2017, and the idea to the morphological analysis start basically when you start looking. There is no census. I think the last census was like 20 or 30 years ago, before the war, so pretty useless. And any population estimation that are in the city range from 500,000 to 1.5 million. So for us, as Tony said, it's really important to have proper data to design a master plan and to have an idea of what a city needs. So one of the key things of the morphological analysis is try to split the city basically in residential and non-residential uses. Understanding most of the residential areas, they're going to have like mixed use, but residential areas for us are areas that are basically for residents. So here we found like 3 main different types of housing areas. We call them type A, type B, and type C. Type A is the high income areas. Type B we classified as a middle income. You can see the different type of plots. You can see different type of housing and density. And on the right image is the low income areas, which is a large proportion of the city. We need to take into account the difference between here and working in Africa and coming from Uruguay. I assume Brazil is pretty much the same. We have census, we have data, but here we don't have anything. So we need to figure out how to make data out of very little. Tony, I don't know if you can. Tony's now, because of COVID, is living with, taking care of his mom, so it's a bit challenging. So if you can see the map here, what we did is we split the whole city into different housing areas. The blue is non-residential, and the light blue is mixed use. And all the rest is between type A, B, and C, which is basically the one I just described. Tony, if you can go to the next one. This is a similar exercise in Aruba, which was part of the same project. And in the case of this, Aruba, is a city in northern Uganda. And for Aruba, we managed to get some census data. So this is a lot more precise. In both cities, we did a household survey just to confirm all our initial findings. Tony? So here, for example, this is the way we tend to analyze the city, especially between like high income and low income areas. The classification is straightforward. Here you can see big houses, big plots. Sorry, I have my kids. Sorry. Big houses with big plots and gardens. And Tony, if you keep going, in the case of Aruba, the middle income was a bit of a mixture, because you can see like new large houses and like still poor rural villages, a lot of huts in Uganda. Keep going, Tony. And this is the more low income sections of the city, which is basically pretty much most of the city. And in this case, it's a small town. It's 100 and something thousand people, so the density is not big. And Tony, can you go? Okay, and this is the project we were working last year until COVID came and we have to stop it in the middle of the process. So the idea, the basis of the project was to develop a master plan for Abeokuta, which is a city north of Lagos in Nigeria. And when we started, we had the same issue, like some of the even governmental sources, they have like a variation on the population estimate, which is massive, the same for like, you can see 500,000 to more than 1 million easily. And we split the city by housing areas. The idea for this was to develop the master plan and suggest some policy recommendation based on figures, or let's say most of the city, there is no sanitation, there is lack of water, electricity, most of the basic infrastructure is lacking. So it's pretty useful to try to put a number to try to estimate how much they need to develop. In the case of Abeokuta, to make things worse, most of the cities, you can see the purple is informal development, and the infrastructure they have is pretty much minimal. And the more the city develop, the more this percentage of informal areas keep growing and growing. So the challenge they have in the future is going to be even bigger than now. Tony? This is another thing we do, which is basic observation of Google Earth and satellite imagery. In some cases, we can go back and if there is plans and there is information from the history, is better. We tend to try to understand the city in a holistic way. But in this case, I think the only map we found was like 20 years ago or 30 years ago. There is nothing before. So it's a big challenge to try to develop and understand the cities. Tony? Okay. You're mute, Tony. Tony, you need to unmute. If you can.
Okay, sorry, I didn't know I'd muted. I think just as well. Okay, I'll finish off. We don't have much more time. So one of the things that is quite important is that the whole process of doing a survey involves engaging with the local community in Africa. You can't just go into a place and interview people without first of all talking to what you might call the gatekeepers, the local community leaders, and so on. And across most of Africa, it's very much traditional communities. So one of the things that we do, apart from involving a lot of local educated youngsters in the survey, so they also get to learn some of the methods and get an interest in urban planning and development, is to map the community areas. So these community areas would obviously be, as far as possible, coordinating with the morphological zones that we've identified. In this case, it's the old city. I should have some pictures to show you. It's quite an interesting old city because there's something called Afro-Brazilian architecture, because a number of ex-slaves from Brazil went back to Africa and they became builders. So there's a particular style of architecture there, all run down and in need of renovation, but quite interesting. So we in the case of Abeokuta, we were there when the pandemic restrictions were on, which limited the surveys that we could do. We did some phone and internet-based surveys based on an informal network. But we do business surveys, flood surveys, blighted areas. We map the buildings, and particularly this mapping of the ethnic and cultural boundaries. This particular part of Nigeria, in southern Nigeria, has, which is the Yoruba, mostly Yoruba area, has a lot of kings, a lot of local kings. There's at least 5 in Abeokuta itself. So the lead planner has to go and visit all the kings and get their approval as well on engaging with the communities. So we map that as well. So just to finish off, some thoughts about how we manage this process of rapid urbanization, which we sometimes call the urban transition, the transition of the world still going on from mainly rural to mainly urban. Urban sustainability and resilience, extremely important, particularly where we were looking at in Abeokuta and outside of Lagos. A lot of informal sprawling development going on into floodplains, destroying the natural vegetation and making flood risk much more likely. So we need to think about the urban and the rural together. Obviously, to work on ways of reducing consumption and waste, that cities can be a vehicle for fossil fuels, you know all about. The issue of inequality, the critical importance of female education, which is probably the main form of contraception that there is, or birth control. Investing in good types of employment, in sustainable infrastructure, and in affordable housing. And it is the case in Africa, everywhere we looked, as well as everywhere else. Land speculation is rife. It's rife in the UK as much as it is in Africa, but it's particularly critical in Africa as a means of accelerating inequality. So we're looking at smart cities, but it's smart cities that are people, not technology focused. And we're looking at smart governance, for which we do need data. There's no doubt about that. Take the SDGs seriously. Just a final example. This was the result of the work that we did in Kaduna from 2008 onwards was a master plan, which was very much based on this idea of resilience and looking at a green spatial development framework for the city, taking on board flood risk and other matters, focused on mass transit solutions. This came from a presentation I gave to the UK Town Planning Institute, so I've ended with train more planners, but for planners you could read anybody in local government really, and this capacity, lack of capacity at the local level is a critical issue, and you can just see from looking at the ratio of planners to the population in a developed country as compared to an underdeveloped country, 37 per 100,000 in the UK, and less than 1 in parts of Africa and Asia as well. So, obrigado, vou deixar coisas lá and open I think we've got a little bit time left for questions if anybody has any. Thank you very much.
Hello, Tony. Yes, we have a question from Bianca. She's a student from Master here at UX. She'd like to know where exactly will you continue your work here in Brazil, if you already know that?
Not at the moment. I think the last time I was in Brazil, we came with the students, and my main contacts are in Pernambuco for historical reasons. Recife was a case study that we did some years back, and and I also have colleagues in São Paulo and Rio. But it's more difficult for us to find work in Latin America because of the funding situation. So I'm a bit relying on Fedi to see what we can find. And it may not be in Brazil, it might be in another country of Latin America. But the partnerships that you form in research are extremely important, and they're very durable, you know, and I still have a close relationship with some of the people that I worked with 20 years ago in Brazil. And sometimes they come to the UK, and it's useful to keep these channels open, but nothing planned at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
Tony, we have another question. How do you think we can engage communities and citizens to local service, like to participate and to answer the service? Or how do you do that?
Can you hold on just a moment? Okay. Cups of tea. Everything has to stop for cups of tea in the UK. It's always a challenge to involve local communities, and you have to work always with partners who know the ground, who know the ground, you know the field. It's no use coming in as outsiders and expect that you can engage. You have to find local partners who are able to intermediate and introduce you into the situation. I'd say that's the first thing. If you can get the local authority, the local government engaged, that's obviously another challenge in itself, partly and often because they're not particularly interested, but B, because they don't have the resources to do it. These are the two most important challenges to overcome. And, I think it's just a question of making sure that it's high on your list of priorities. And the work that we've been doing in Nigeria recently, we work with UN Habitat, and basically we have to show that we're making efforts to engage local communities in the process. But also it's not straightforward, who do you mean by the local community? The people that you talk to may not be representative of all the interests in the local community. So it needs some close understanding of how the communities work. Before I was an urban planner and designer, I worked as an architect in London with a group of radical architects giving technical aid, and we would be commissioned to work directly with communities. I think there's a good idea if communities can have their own consultants, and that was done through a grant system from the Greater London Authority that existed then. Communities would bid for a grant to develop their facilities, and that was the basis on which we engage with communities. And something also we're interested is something called community asset management. That is getting communities involved in managing their own facilities, like the public facilities. We did a lot of work in India on schools where they weren't being properly repaired by the government. So we'd go and work with the communities and use their own skills and get the government to give some of their finance to the community to do the work. So practical engagement, I think, is one way. But it's quite energy intensive and resource intensive and time intensive. And you need organizations that are funded basically to help to do this, I think.
Okay, Tony, do we have time for another question?
I have time if everybody else does, yes.
Okay, so Thais would like to know, what is your biggest motivation for work and for these works, and your searches, and also the biggest difficulty that you find out?
Motivation.
Yeah, and difficulties.
Let me ask Fedi, what makes you motivated to work in this field, Fedi? I've been doing it for so long I've forgotten. I don't know anything else. It's absolutely fascinating world, and if for me it's working internationally, and the reward of knowing that wherever you work in the world, whoever you work with, you will make friends, and that is a kind of encouraging aspect of humanity. There's plenty of discouraging aspects of humanity. But what's true is that people have common understanding wherever you go. And although you have to be understanding of local cultural practices and behavior and the rest of it, there are always some common ground that you can find. And, the home, the place where people live, the place where people meet, this is common to every community in the world. They have these kind of facilities, and this is why urban planning and development's very endlessly fascinating subject. It's very wide, and that's all encompassing. So you can come at it from any direction. So it's a kind of a philosophy and practice, I'd say. Fedi, what do you reckon?
Yeah, I totally agree, Tony. Is especially working in Africa is amazing, and every project we work is sort of different and different challenge. Every culture, even though it's the same continent, is quite different from the east of Africa to west of Africa, and you always have to think outside of the box, because all these planning, regulation, and these things you can have like in more developed countries like Brazil with a proper system. They don't work there because they don't have one of the latest projects we showed the city in Nigeria. They never had a plan in the history, so the city just grow. The bad thing is a lot of the work or proposal we tend to produce, they are never implemented.
Mm-hmm. It's a process, it's a and actually the people that you meet, because also wherever you go, although there's a lot of corruption as everywhere, there are a lot of people who want to progress things, and encouraging them, helping develop new skills. These are all things that can leave a mark, even if your plans don't come to fruition. It's always work in progress. That's why I'd say it's in conjunction with what you guys are doing. It's all urban management. It's all the management process. It's not, planning is part of it. Great if you can get the plans to work. You need to monitor them. You need to review them. You need the data to be able to do that. And that's something that we're very clear that is something that we want to leave behind. But, we left it behind in Kaduna, and it fell into ruin. So we have to go back every now and again and help to get these systems working. Progress is slow, but I think there is progress, and we have to be clever and innovative and think on our feet to think of new ways to do things. So I think it's particularly interesting to be asked to talk to this group, and from the perspective of the work that you're doing, which is obviously about trying to find out about what local people think about things and how that can improve local service delivery, is absolutely vital. It's the same here in the UK. Local governments try, but they are resource strapped, so things are also always, local government is under-resourced, and we need to think about where given scarce resources, where the effort should go in order to keep things moving along. And obviously then there's politics comes into the whole thing, so we're in another game there. So people who make promises that don't deliver, they're called politicians. Are there any politicians with us? They're obviously better equipped and better informed political decisions, and that's what we want to inform, really. So good politics informed by good knowledge, good relationships with local people. Those are the key things, I'd say.
Thank you, Tony. One last question, or maybe an advice you could give us in Brazil. As you are working with a lot of data, and here we have a kind of delay on some data, like the national, the municipes, the cities data. And what advice would you give us so that we can keep on our work, on our research with this kind of limited data that we have?
Yeah, I guess the way we do it is sowing seeds. So what you want, of course, is data across the whole country. Brazil, huge country. I've done work in Pernambuco, in state of Rio, in a small town, so the data is going to be very variable, and the important thing, I think, is networking. So try and establish and maintain a network of people in different parts of Brazil who can inform this, so that you can then show how effective it can be, and you've got examples across the country that you can draw on. So I don't know if I think you are working with other cities and other organizations. That I'd say is the critical thing, and sharing lessons of best practice between cities. I'm aware, I'm not a statistician, but I've sort of had to be really over the years, and I was for a while the urban statistics advisor for the UK government at UN, and at that time there was quite a big movement for urban what do they call them? I've even forgotten what they were. The urban observatories, that's right. And we did some work in Brazil with various NGOs and so on good practice. Was just before the first PT government, when everybody joined the government. So there were a lot of movements. There's a lot of popular organizations that you could relate to as well. So that sort of movement from below and engaging with it is very, very critical, I think. And sometimes the radicals go to sleep and not much happens, but there's always somebody doing something, working at the local level, and not agree with they might be reliable, but keeping the networks across the country and then locally, I think, is the key to a sustainable approach. And you will need time to build it, basically. But try and keep it going, basically, is my advice. Nothing new, I should think, but, that's what I would suggest. You can't do everywhere. You can't do everything. So you've got to build up from below. Hopefully you'll get a federal government that you can work with sometime soon, one hopes. And then make the most of that while you get the chance, I would say, because it might disappear again. So I follow what happens in Brazil fairly closely, and I have a number of friends who keep me posted. And we wish you all the luck, and hope that your ordeal will be over soon. That's as I see it, of course. I mean, there may be some Bolsonaristas listening, so I apologize if I upset anybody, but I don't I don't agree with what's happening in Brazil at the moment. I think it's a bit tragic. So we are doing this work on COVID. We don't have a Brazilian case study as such. I have somebody I have in mind. I didn't want to get Raquel to do it because she's got to finish her course. So, but we may link up with getting an inside story, and that's very much based on how can you localize the response to a pandemic more effectively. That's the kind of idea of the research, both in terms of the physical use of space, but also, how communities can get involved, and how the damage that it does not only to health but to the local economy for people who can't stop working. They have to work. So, how do we better manage this kind of pandemic? And you need data for that as well, of course.
Tony, we have one more question. If you can answer that, then we are calling off the questions.
Okay.
Let me just check here. So from Vinicius, he's asking, what is the influence of regional planning, like metropolitan regions, for local urban planning in the cities?
It's absolutely critical for the obvious reasons that cities don't respect borders. Urban development doesn't respect borders. In order to sustain the cities, they need to draw on the regions around them. This has been a fundamental aspect of, if you like, the Gedesian approach that Max Locke has always had. So we always try and do metropolitan scale planning because we're looking at the future development of the city, often trying to constrain urban development when it's destroying good agricultural land. This is very typical in Nigeria. Farmers don't make much money from farming, so they'll just sell off their land for people to build houses, and that's the way that the cities expand. So we need to think about that and about the resources that come from the surrounding region. Essential, really, metropolitan and regional scale planning, absolutely essential. So we've been asked, this is because of the work that Max Locke's been done in Nigeria over decades. It's a name that's still known in the north of Nigeria and in Borno State, which is where the Boko Haram insurrection still rumbling on. Quite a big state and then poor state in northeast of Brazil. We may well do some planning there, and the first thing we do is regional planning, because we need to look at how the city works, how the state really. So definitely critical, and you can't just. You need to understand the big picture before you can prioritize local action, really.
Okay, thank you, Tony, for answering our questions. I just want to ask Professor Ana to give a few words.
May I speak in Portuguese, Tony and Rodrigo?
Pode falar.
Ok. Então, eu gostaria de agradecer muito a participação de vocês. Tony, Frederico, muito obrigada pela sua participação hoje, muito importante. Esse é um momento super desafiador para todos nós, né? Eu sei que o Tony fez todo um esforço para se organizar, para estar aqui com a gente, então muito obrigada. E a gente estamos muito contentes com essa aproximação. Queria agradecer a Raquel por ter feito essa aproximação, ao professor Marcelo, que está aqui nos assistindo também. Muito obrigada, a gente espera que isso possa ser o início de talvez uma colaboração mais ampla entre nós, e nós somos uma universidade comunitária no sul do Brasil, com um funcionamento muito conectado com o desenvolvimento da nossa cidade, da nossa região. Então, quem sabe possamos repetir esses momentos como esse, ou colaborar de outras formas, né? Nós estamos aqui totalmente à disposição de vocês para o que for de interesse em termos de colaboração de pesquisa. Então é isso, queria agradecer a vocês por isso, esperando que a gente possa continuar em contato e continuar colaborando. Quero agradecer a Suelen e a Cristiane pela moderação aqui, pela mediação, agradecer ao grupo de bolsistas que se envolveram na organização dessa aula magna, a equipe técnica da UX, e agradecer a todas as pessoas que nos acompanharam nessa tarde. Eu tenho certeza que nós teríamos ainda muitas outras questões, e fiquem à vontade, pessoal, quem quiser pode encaminhar as questões para o PPGA, para a UX, e a gente vai dar o encaminhamento, tá bem? Então, agradecemos a presença de todos, muito obrigado, um bom final de dia para quem está no Brasil, uma boa noite para os nossos amigos na Inglaterra. Então, esperamos ver a todos brevemente. Obrigada.
Muito obrigado.
Obrigado.
Tchau, tchau.
Tchau, tchau. Bye, bye.
Tchau, obrigada.
Tchau.
Thank you, bye.
Bye, bye.
Bye.